So guys, in today's video we're going to be talking about receptors. We're going to talk about receptor potential, generator potentials, and we're going to be mainly talking about the differential sensibilities versus the label line principle. In addition to that, we're going to be talking about adaptations, and in addition to that, we're going to be talking about tonic and phasic receptors. So let's get into it. So what are two types of receptors? So how do two different types of receptors respond to how do two different types of receptors detect different types of stimuli? Well, the answer is very similar. It's simple. It's based upon differential sensitivities. For each type of receptor, there is a specific stimuli and is non-responsive to another type of stimuli. So it's going to be responsive to a specific stimuli and it's also non-responsive to a specific stimuli. For example, electromagnetic receptors, they are receptive to, of course, rods and cones, so they detect light, but they are not sensitive to, for example, hearing, for example, pain, for example, pressure, heat, sound. Non-responsive to heat, pressure, sound, but they are responsive to light. Now the next thing is going to be chemoreceptor. Chemoreceptors are going to be those that are going to be responsive to changes. Chemoreceptors in the supraoptic nucleus. They detect minute changes in osmolarity. However, it is non-responsive to sound. So let me repeat that again. So basically, if we look at a chemoreceptor, well, chemoreceptors, they are responsive to osmolarity, but they are not responsive to the sound, they're not responsive to sound, but they are responsive to osmolarity. The next thing I want to talk about is how do different nerve fibers transmit different modalities of sensitivities. If all that being transmitted is simply impulses, well, this is going to be due to the label line principle, which is going to be each nerve tract terminates at a specific point in the central nervous system, and the type of sensitivity felt when a nerve fiber is stimulated is determined by the output in that nervous system for which that fiber leads. For example, if a pain fiber is stimulated, the person perceives pain regardless of what type of fiber it is. So regardless of what type of stimulus excites the fiber. So a label line principle is very simple. It's just like one line. So each nerve tract it terminates at a specific point in the central nervous system, and the type of sensation felt by when a nerve fiber is stimulated is determined by the point in the nervous system to which the fiber leads to. So that's very simple, that basically it is the nerve tract terminates at a specific point in the central nervous system, and the type of sensation felt when a nerve fiber is stimulated is determined by the central nervous system. So it's determined by the nervous system to which the fiber leads to. So for example, like I said, the brain fiber, it can be stimulated regardless of what type of fiber is going to be, what type of stimulus excites the fibers. And likewise, a touch fiber, it's going to be stimulated regardless of whatever type of stimulus it's involved in. So touch fiber is going to be stimulated by the electrical excitation of the touch receptor, or otherwise the person perceives touch because the touch fiber leads to specific touch areas in the brain. Similarly, fibers in the retina of the eye terminate in the vision areas of the brain. Fibers of the ear terminate in the auditory areas of the brain, and the temperature fibers they basically terminate in the temperature areas of the brain. So if I were to repeat what is label line principle is basically nerve fibers, and it depends on where they terminate in the brain. So, and they can be stimulated by a stimulus regardless of where they are terminated in the brain. So each nerve tract it terminates at a specific point in the central nervous system, and the type of sensation felt when the nerve fiber is stimulated is determined by the point on the nervous system to which the fiber leads to. Receptor potential and generator potential. Let me talk a bit more about that. Receptor potential is basically any change in the membrane. It does not lead to, it leads to an actual potential, but it itself is not an actual potential. So what are these type of receptor potential and then the generator potential? So first of all, we'll talk about electromagnetically. We'll talk about mechanical deformations of the receptors. Mechanical deformation of receptors is the receptor potential, and the generator perception potential is the opening of the ion channels. Application to a chemical application of a chemical to a membrane. This is going to be and this opens ion channels. changes in temperature. This causes temperature change, permeability to the membrane, and effect of electromagnetic radiation, such as light or retinal visual receptor, which either directly or indirectly changes the receptor potential, receptor membrane characteristics, and allows ions to flow through the membrane channels. In all instances, the basic cause of this change in membrane potential is a change in membrane permeability of the receptor, and allows ions to be diffused more and less readily through the membrane, and is thereby to change in the transfer potential. So now the next thing I want to talk about is going to be, so basically let me recap what I'm saying over here. There's going to be receptor potential and generator potential. So first of all, there is mechanical deformations of the membrane of the receptor, which leads to ion influx, ion channels opening, which leads to opening of ion channels. So yeah, now the next one is going to be going to be a chemical change and chemicals to the membrane, which causes a influx, opens of ion channels. Ion channels, and then there's going to be a chemical. I talk about mechanical, maybe a temperature. Temperature changes leads to opening or closing leads to permeability of the membrane. And then over here we have the electromagnetical, so stimulus of the retinal receptors. It leads to a direct or indirect membrane characteristics, which allow ions to flow through the membrane of the channels. So electromagnetic, so everything, there's going to be a stimulus. So the receptors, we're going to have mechanical, chemical, electrochemical, and temperature, and this leads to permeability of ions, opening of ion channels, ions diffusing down the gradient, regardless. So any changes in membrane potential. In all cases, the change in membrane potential is going to be known as a receptor potential, which allows ions to diffuse readily through the membrane. This is going to be known as transmembrane potential. So transmembrane potential is known as ions readily diffusing down the membrane. And now what's the relationship between the receptor potential and the generator potential? So relationship, receptor potential and generator potential. So when the receptor potential when the receptor potential rises above the threshold, well then that generates generator potentials, and generator potentials, it keeps on going on and on and on, and action potentials occur. Nerve fibers attached to the surface, and action potential occurs. And then the stronger the receptor potential, the stronger the frequency of generator potentials. Generator potential are basically action potentials, nothing too fancy over here. And what's the relationship between a stimulus and sensation? We'll dive into that. What's the relation? So in the beginning there was an increased rate of discharge. So in the beginning there was going to be increased rate of discharge, but towards the end is going to be very low rate of discharge. So increase intensity, the receptor potential will also increase. Note that amplitude increases rapidly at first, but then progressively less rapidly at high stimulus strength. The maximum amplitude of the receptor potential is 100 millivolts, and it is illicit in extreme cases of intensity. The frequency of action potential increase proportionally with the increase in receptor potential. From this graph, we can state that very intense stimulation of receptor would cause a progressive less and less additional increase of numbers of action potentials. This is because the amplitude of the receptor potential gradually levels off at high intensities. So the amplitude of receptor potentials, they gradually level off at high intensities. This is extremely important principle that is applicable to almost all sensory receptors. It allows the receptor to be sensitive to very weak sensory experience, and yet not reaching maximum firing rate until the sensory experience is extreme. This allows the receptors to have an extreme range of response from very weak to very intense. So very weak to very intense. Let me just recap what I'm saying over here. So basically, and as intensity increases, the rate of discharge also, the receptor potential also, as intensity increases, the receptor potential also does increase. Note the amplitude increases rapidly at first, but less rapidly at high stimulus. The maximum amplitude of receptor potential is 100 millivolts and is elicited at extreme cases of intensity. the frequency of action potential increases proportionally with the increase in receptor potential. From this graph, we can state that the very intense stimulation of the receptor will cause a progressively less and less increase in intense action potential. So intense stimulation causes progressively less and less increase of action potentials. This is because of the amplitude of the receptor potential levels also at high intensities, amplitude levels also at high intensities. So there's a extremely important principle that is applicable to almost all sensory receptors. So it allows receptors to be sensitive to very weak sensory experiences and yet not reach a maximum firing rate until sensory experience is extreme. So this allows receptor to have an exchange range of response from very weak to very intense. Let's move on to adaptation. Adaptation is when you send a continuous signal, a stimulated signal. It does not cause to me a continuous stimulus. Continuous or sustained stimulus is elicited. Initially, the receptors will respond. Initially, the receptors will respond with a high firing rate, but after time has passed, the impulse rate would decrease. So after time has passed, impulse rate would decrease, but initially, when there's a continuous or sustained signal, there is going to be the receptor will respond at a very high firing rate, but after time has passed, the impulse rate will decrease. So there's going to be rapid firing potentials such as Pachynian corpuscles and slow adapting receptors such as joint capsule and muscle such as spindle receptor. Receptors take hours to days to adapt. Non-adapting receptors. Longest is going to be the mechanoreceptors, taking 2 days, which is adaptation for keratin and erotic bioreceptors. Some chemo and pain receptors are never adapting completely. So mechanism of adaptation, accommodation and redistribution of fluid. So accommodation is going to be basically the process when a central nerve fiber it receives a stimulus, gradually becomes accommodated. This is going to be due to inactivations of sodium channels and further changes in transmembrane potential. So there's no more potentials or accommodation. There's no more action potential. This is going to be by gradually closing the inactivation of the sodium channels. And another thing to mention is that the central nerve fiber continues to receive stimuli and is gradually abducted. The next thing I want to talk about is redistribution of fluids. Redistribution of fluids is going to be the Pachyman corpuscles. The P corpuscle is a viscoelastic structure, so distorting forces on one side of the corpuscle will be transmitted using a viscous fluid, and this initiates action potential. So any type of this is a vasoelectric structure, so any type of distorting forces will be forces on one side of the corpuscle will be transmitted to the side of the central nervous system, and the viscous fluid will be initiating the action potential and preventing any other action potential. So now one more thing I want to mention is tonic receptors. Tonic receptors is when there is a continuous stimulus which is going to the brain. They very slowly adapt, they very slowly create action potential. Example of this is going to be joint capsule and muscle spindles. So when there is a continuous signal to the brain after a long stimulus is present, they send impulses at a continuous strength and are slowly adapting and transmit for many hours. Useful for transmitting information about the status of the body. Additionally, these another examples can be baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors, which are going to be measuring the blood pressure, so these are going to be sensitive ones, and they can be considered mechanoreceptors, I believe, so I'm not too sure. And chemoreceptors are going to be iotic or the carotid bodies. And how about phasic receptors? Phasic receptors are those receptors which are going to be very rapidly adapting, very rapid. So, for example, the Pachyman corpuscles. The Pachyman corpuscles, when sudden pressure is applied, the tissue excites the receptors for a few milliseconds. This is excited over and over, even though the pressure continues, but later it is transmitted signal again, and when the pressure is released, the change in stimulus strength or intensity. So guys, that's been it. If you like this video, please leave a like, and hope to release more content soon. See you guys later.